The grandfather clock's steady rhythm mocked Gerald as he sat alone at his mahogany desk, the dinner dishes long since cleared. His weathered hands trembled, crinkling the edge of Claire's credit card statement, the one she thought she'd hidden. Lamplight caught the moisture welling in his eyes as he traced a finger over hotel charges in a town she'd never mentioned visiting. A sob caught in his throat, salt tears mixing with the lingering scent of coffee and her fading perfume. Has betrayal left you shattered like Gerald? Share your story below. Like if this strikes a chord, follow to discover how he fights back. He glanced at their wedding photo, 43 years captured in silver, now casting shadows he'd never noticed before. The home they'd built together suddenly felt hollow, creaking with unfamiliar emptiness. As his tear fell onto the statement, blurring the damning evidence, a car door slammed outside. Gerald wiped his eyes and straightened his shoulders. She was home. Gerald Mason eased himself into his favorite leather chair, the one that had witnessed 40 years of family gatherings in his wood-paneled den. Afternoon light filtered through lace curtains, catching dust motes that danced above the polished oak desk where he'd sorted through the day's mail. His weathered fingers paused on an envelope with the family lawyer's letterhead. Strange. Margaret hadn't mentioned any legal matters. The grandfather clock in the corner marked time with solemn ticks as he slid his thumb under the flap. Something felt wrong. The paper inside bore the familiar letterhead, but the signature at the bottom sent a chill through his chest. After 45 years as a master carpenter, Gerald's eye for detail caught the slight hesitation in the final stroke of Thompson's name. "Can't be right," he whispered, voice cracking in the empty room. Images flooded his mind. Margaret at Thompson's office just last week, her excuse about updating her will, the hushed phone call that ended when he entered the kitchen. Gerald's vision blurred as he reached for the silver-framed photo on the side table. Their grandchildren's smiling faces at last summer's reunion stared back at him, unaware that the foundation of their family might be crumbling. A sob caught in his throat. His hand pressed against his chest as if to hold the pieces together. The letter trembled in his grip. Years of solving problems with worn hands and patient precision hadn't prepared him for this betrayal. His mind, still sharp at 68, began cataloging the discrepancies. Margaret's recent late nights, the unexplained withdrawals from their joint account, her sudden interest in private conversations with their daughter Emily. Tears fell. He wiped them away with the back of his hand, inadvertently smudging the letter. That's when he noticed it, an ink smear that shouldn't be there if the document had been printed days ago as dated. The paper stock felt wrong too, thinner than Thompson's usual heavy bond. Gerald shook his head slowly, his breathing steadying as suspicion replaced heartache. Something wasn't adding up, and if there was one thing he'd learned through decades of craftsmanship, it was that flawed foundations eventually revealed themselves. A gentle knock at the den door interrupted his thoughts. Gerald tucked the letter into his shirt pocket, straightened his shoulders, and cleared his throat. 45 years of marriage deserved more than hasty conclusions. He'd get to the truth, one careful step at a time. Gerald's hand trembled as he reached for the doorknob. The familiar weight of it steadied him momentarily. He'd crafted and installed it himself during their 30th anniversary renovation. Composing himself with a deep breath, he opened the door to find Emily, their daughter, standing in the hallway. "Dad, you okay?" Emily's concerned eyes studied his face. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "I'm fine, sweetheart," he replied, the words catching slightly in his throat. His carpenter's instinct to measure twice before cutting kept him from mentioning the letter. He noticed Emily glance past him toward Margaret's desk, her expression flickering with something, worry, guilt. The grandfather clock chimed 5, its resonance filling the sudden silence between them. Gerald had built that clock for Margaret on their 25th anniversary, each piece of cherry wood selected and shaped by hands that knew her almost as well as they knew themselves. Mom asked me to tell you she's running late. Book club went long. Emily shifted her weight, not quite meeting his eyes. Another discrepancy. Margaret had mentioned lunch with her sister, not book club. After Emily left, Gerald sank back into his chair, the leather creaking beneath him like old joints in winter. The den's comforting familiarity now felt hollow, each shadow a potential hiding place for secrets. The coffee in his mug had gone cold, bitter like the thoughts swirling through his mind. He dialed Thompson's office number from memory, fingers hesitating over each button. The receptionist's cheerful voice answered. "Gerald Mason calling for Richard Thompson, please." "I'm sorry, Mr. Mason. Mr. Thompson is out of town at a conference until Wednesday." Gerald's free hand clenched against his thigh. "When did he leave?" "Monday morning, sir. Would you like to leave a message?" Monday. 3 days ago. The letter in his pocket was dated yesterday. "No message," he managed, his voice steadier than he felt. "Thank you kindly." He hung up, the weight of confirmation pressing against his chest. 45 years of trust, dissolving like sawdust in rain. Gerald pulled the silver photo frame closer, tracing the edge he'd routined with such care. In the dwindling afternoon light, he noticed something he'd missed before. Margaret's jewelry box was missing from her desk. The box had been his first anniversary gift to her, inlaid with maple and walnut in a pattern matching their bedroom furniture. She'd never moved it, not once in all these years. Gerald stood, determination replacing the ache in his chest. He crossed to Margaret's desk and tried the top drawer, locked. In 45 years of marriage, there had never been locked drawers between them. Outside, a car pulled into the driveway. Gerald straightened his shirt, wiped his eyes, and prepared to look into the face he'd loved for nearly half a century, searching for the truth in her eyes while hiding the questions in his own. Gerald moved to the bay window as headlights swept across the front yard. It wasn't Margaret's sedan that pulled into the driveway, but Emily's SUV again. He watched as his daughter sat motionless behind the wheel, phone pressed to her ear, her free hand gesturing emphatically. Who was she talking to with such intensity? When she glanced toward the house, Gerald stepped back into the shadows. The evening had settled into that peculiar stillness that comes with approaching dusk. Gerald slipped the forged letter into his pocket and made his way through the kitchen to the back garden. The rose bushes Margaret tended so carefully stood like sentinels along the flagstone path he'd laid the summer after his retirement. Their wrought iron garden bench, another anniversary creation from his workshop, waited beneath the old oak tree. Gerald lowered himself onto it, wincing as his knee protested. The metal was cool against his palms, a stark contrast to the warmth of memory that washed over him. Margaret sitting here just last week, her hushed phone conversation ending abruptly when he'd approached with iced tea. From his pocket, he withdrew not only the lawyer's letter but a folded bank statement he'd discovered last week. He'd set it aside then, assuming Margaret had made a mistake recording their withdrawals. Now, the unexplained $15,000 transfer to an account he didn't recognize loomed like a judgment. 45 years, he whispered to the gathering darkness. A cricket chirped nearby, nature's metronome keeping time with his racing heart. The garden had always been their sanctuary, the place where they'd planned their future, celebrated successes, weathered sorrows. Now it felt like a witness to betrayal. He spread the papers on his lap, aligning their edges with the precision of a man who'd spent decades ensuring every joint and seam was perfect. The evening breeze carried the scent of Margaret's roses, once comforting, now somehow cloying. When a tear splashed onto the bank statement, Gerald didn't wipe it away, letting it blur the damning numbers. A twig snapped on the garden path. Gerald looked up to see Emily approaching, her silhouette backlit by the kitchen lights. He quickly folded the papers and returned them to his pocket. "Dad," What are you doing out here in the dark? Just thinking, Emmy. He hadn't called her that since she was a teenager. Your mother's book club must be running very late. Emily's hesitation was barely perceptible, but to a father who'd watched her grow from infant to woman, it might as well have been a shout. She texted. She's having dinner with Aunt Susan after. Another lie. Susan had called this morning about her upcoming cruise. She was in Florida already. Sit with me a minute. Gerald patted the bench beside him. As Emily settled next to him, he noticed she kept her phone clutched in her hand, screen down. Is there something I should know about your mother? Emily stiffened beside him. What do you mean? I think you know exactly what I mean. His voice remained gentle, the same tone he'd used when teaching her to sand wood grain, firm but patient. In the heavy silence that followed, a shadow moved near the garden gate. Gerald squinted into the darkness, catching the outline of a figure retreating. Someone had been listening. Who's there? He called, rising from the bench with surprising agility for a man his age. But the shadow was gone, leaving only questions hanging in the night air, and the certainty that tomorrow would bring a confrontation nearly half a century in the making. Morning light filtered through the dusty attic window as Gerald climbed the last step of the narrow staircase. His joints protested, but determination pushed him forward. Margaret had left early, another fundraiser committee meeting, she'd claimed, kissing his cheek before hurrying out. The casual brush of her lips had felt like a stranger's. After 45 years, Gerald knew his wife's patterns. The third floorboard from the attic door always creaked unless you stepped on its edge. Margaret had been up here recently, and she'd known exactly where to place her foot. The attic had been Gerald's domain, a carefully organized archive of their life together. But something was different. His carpenter's eye caught the subtle disturbance in the dust pattern near the old steamer trunk where they kept important documents. Someone had moved it, then tried to replace it precisely. Not precisely enough. Gerald knelt beside the trunk, ignoring the protest in his knees. The brass lock hung open. He always secured it. His heart hammered against his ribs as he lifted the heavy lid. Their documents lay in meticulous order: birth certificates, their marriage license, property deeds, a paper timeline of their life together. He riffled through them, looking for anything out of place. When he reached the section containing their financial records, he froze. The folder containing their will was thinner than it should be. No, Margaret, he whispered, voice breaking the attic's silence. What have you done? His hands, strong and steady through decades of precision work, trembled as he opened the folder. The copy of their most recent will was missing. In its place was an older version, one from before they'd updated it to include provisions for their grandchildren's education. A harsh sob escaped him, echoing in the cramped space. He pressed his fist against his mouth, as if to physically hold back the sound of his heart breaking. Moving with renewed purpose, Gerald shifted the trunk completely. Behind it, tucked into the corner where rafter met wall, was a small lockbox he'd never seen before. It wasn't locked. Inside lay a passport, Margaret's, but with a recent issue date. Their existing passports were downstairs in the fireproof safe. Why would she need a second one? Beneath it lay bank statements from an account in her name only, dating back 6 months. Regular deposits, all just under $10,000, large enough to be significant, small enough to avoid triggering bank reporting requirements. Gerald's vision blurred with tears of rage and betrayal. Dad? Emily's voice called from below. Are you up there? Gerald quickly returned everything to its place, positioning the trunk exactly as he'd found it. He pocketed only a single bank statement as evidence. Just looking for some old photos, he called back, his voice steadier than he felt. As he descended the stairs, wiping dust from his hands onto his jeans, Emily watched him with an unreadable expression. Mom called. She's bringing dinner tonight. Said she has something important to discuss with us. Gerald nodded, the statement in his pocket feeling like a hot coal against his thigh. I'll bet she does. Dad, is everything okay with you two? That depends, Gerald said, looking his daughter straight in the eye, on whether you're going to tell me what you know or if I need to wait for your mother's performance tonight. Emily's face crumpled. She sank onto the hallway bench, the one Gerald had salvaged and restored from her childhood home after her grandparents passed. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. She swore you'd never find out until it was too late to stop her. Gerald leaned against the wall, suddenly feeling every one of his 68 years. Stop her from what, exactly? Emily looked up, her eyes swimming with tears and something else. Fear. From taking everything you've built together. Gerald stared at his daughter, her words hanging in the air between them like smoke. Everything, he repeated, the single word falling from his lips like a stone. She's been planning it for months, Emily continued, her voice barely above a whisper. Mom found someone else, a financial advisor from her charity board. Gerald sank onto the bench beside her, the polished oak, wood he'd salvaged from their first home's flooring, now seeming to mock the foundation he thought they'd built together. I didn't know at first, Emily said, wringing her hands. She told me she was protecting assets for retirement, for the grandchildren. But then I saw them together at Riverfront Park last month. Her voice trailed off. Say it, Gerald prompted, his throat tight. They were kissing, Dad, like teenagers. Emily's face crumpled. When I confronted her, she swore it was just a brief midlife rebellion. But then the paperwork started. Account transfers, property deed revisions. She asked me to notarize something last week, and I saw... What did you see? His voice sounded strange in his own ears, hollow and distant. A revised will, leaving almost everything to her, with a provision for a business partnership with this man, Russell Harmon. Gerald nodded slowly. The name was familiar. He'd met the man at a fundraising gala last year, younger than Margaret by at least 15 years, smooth-talking, with manicured nails that had never known a day's hard labor. She's meeting with the lawyers today, Emily continued. The papers will be finalized tomorrow. Gerald stood abruptly, moved to the window overlooking the backyard, the workshop where he'd spent thousands of hours creating furniture for their home, gifts for their children, toys for their grandchildren, all about to be signed away by the woman who'd stood beside him for nearly half a century. Why tell me now? He asked, not turning around. Because I can't be part of it anymore. Because you deserve better. Emily's voice broke. Because she's my mother. But you're my father. And this isn't right. Outside, rain had begun to fall, pattering against the glass like distant applause. Gerald watched a drop trace its way down the window pane, splitting into smaller rivulets before disappearing. I trusted her with everything, he said finally. Every dream, every fear, every penny we ever earned. I know, Dad. Gerald turned, his face carved with grief, but his eyes suddenly clear. The bank statements in the attic. The account numbers. Do you recognize them? Emily nodded reluctantly. One is the account she opened with him. The other is Grandma Mason's trust fund, the one for the grandchildren's college. The room seemed to tilt. Gerald braced himself against the windowsill, a strangled sound escaping him. His mother's legacy, meant to secure his grandchildren's future, now being siphoned away for Margaret's new life. He'd built their first kitchen table from pine salvaged from his childhood home, made their bed frame from cherry harvested from the family land, crafted rocking chairs, bookshelves, cradles, each piece a tangible expression of his love and commitment. The thought of another man sitting among the artifacts of his devotion was unbearable. Betrayal left you breathless like Gerald. Share your story below. like if this strikes home, follow to see how he fights for justice when all seems lost. "What happens now?" Emily asked quietly. Gerald straightened his shoulders, the master craftsman assessing a project gone awry. "Now," he said, his voice finding its strength, "I salvage what I can." He crossed to the antique secretary desk in the corner, another piece he'd restored, and pulled out a business card. Richard Thompson, their family lawyer for 20 years. "The real Richard Thompson." "Call him," Gerald instructed, handing the card to Emily. "Tell him I need to see him immediately. And Emily?" "Yes, Dad?" "Tell him to bring every document we've ever signed. It's time to see exactly what we're dealing with." As Emily made the call, Gerald returned to the window. The rain was coming down harder now, washing away the last traces of the life he thought he'd built. Richard Thompson's office smelled of leather and lemon polish, a scent that had once represented security to Gerald. Now, surrounded by stacks of legal documents spread across the conference table, it felt like the scene of an autopsy, his marriage, dissected and laid bare. "It's thorough, I'll give her that," Thompson said, removing his reading glasses and pinching the bridge of his nose. "Margaret's been systematically transferring assets for months." "The forgeries are impressive. If I hadn't been looking for discrepancies, I might have missed them myself." Gerald ran his weathered hand over a property deed. Their lakeside cabin, a retirement project he'd built board by board over 3 summers. According to the paperwork, Margaret now owned it outright. "How much is left?" Gerald asked, his voice steady despite the hollowness in his chest. Thompson shuffled through papers. "Your personal workshop and its contents, your truck, the tools therein, a checking account with approximately $17,000. Apparently she missed that one, and—" He hesitated. "And?" Gerald prompted. "And a small life insurance policy she likely forgot about. You changed the beneficiary to your grandchildren directly after your heart scare 2 years ago." Gerald nodded, remembering the minor procedure that had reminded him of his mortality. That small precaution had inadvertently saved something for the next generation. "What about the prenuptial agreement?" Emily asked from her seat beside Gerald. "You and Mom signed one, right, Dad?" Gerald's eyes met Thompson's, a silent conversation passing between them. "We did," Gerald confirmed. "Before we married. Margaret insisted, ironically. Her parents thought I was after their money, a carpenter marrying their college-educated daughter." Thompson pulled a document from the bottom of a stack, handling it with something like reverence. "I have the original here. It's unusual." Gerald took the yellowed paper, recognizing Margaret's elegant handwriting on the margins, notes they'd made together, planning their future. The memory of her sitting across his workbench, ink on her fingertips as they'd drafted their dreams, twisted in his chest. "Unusual how?" Emily asked. "It's ironclad in Gerald's favor," Thompson explained. "If either party is proven to have committed fraud or material deception in financial matters, all jointly acquired assets revert to the wronged party." Gerald stared at the document, remembering the young woman who'd insisted on protecting him from potential accusations of fortune hunting. The bitter irony wasn't lost on him. "Will it hold up?" he asked. "With the evidence we've compiled of Margaret's actions?" "Absolutely, especially with the forged documents and hidden accounts." For the first time in days, Gerald felt something other than despair, a flicker of the same determination that had carried him through decades of challenging projects. He'd never left a job unfinished, never delivered less than his best work. He wouldn't start now. "What do we do?" Gerald asked, straightening in his chair. Thompson leaned forward. "First, we file emergency injunctions freezing all accounts and property transfers. Then we document every forgery, every hidden transaction. We build a case so solid even Harmon's fancy Chicago attorneys can't dismantle it." "And Harmon?" Gerald's voice hardened at the name. "What do we know about him?" Thompson slid a folder across the table. Emily gave me his information yesterday. I had my investigator do some digging. He tapped the folder. 3 previous relationships with wealthy women, all ending with substantial financial settlements in his favor. No criminal record, but a pattern of civil complaints that were settled privately. Gerald opened the folder, studying the photograph of the man who'd stolen his wife's heart and nearly his life's work. Harmon's confident smile and tailored suit couldn't hide the calculation in his eyes. "He's done this before," Gerald said quietly, understanding dawning. "And Margaret may not even realize it," Emily added. "She thinks this is some grand romance." Gerald closed the folder, decision crystallizing. He turned to Thompson. "I want everything done by the book. Nothing that can be challenged later. I want the truth to come out, not just for me, but for Margaret. She needs to see what's really happening." Thompson nodded, respect evident in his expression. "We file first thing tomorrow. But Gerald, you should know, this gets ugly fast. Are you prepared for that?" Gerald thought of the workshop waiting for him at home, of the half-finished cradle he'd been building for Emily's expected child, his first great-grandchild. He thought of the grandchildren who would lose their education funds, of the family legacy being dismantled piece by piece. "I've never walked away from a project that mattered," he said simply. "And this one matters more than most." As they gathered the documents, Gerald felt the weight of grief lifting slightly, replaced by purpose. The craftsman in him recognized that sometimes, to save the structure, you had to tear down the damaged parts and rebuild from the foundation. "Thompson," he said as they prepared to leave, "I want to be there when she's served the papers. I need to see her face when she realizes what Harmon's really after." "Are you sure?" Emily asked, concern evident in her voice. Gerald nodded, a sad smile touching his lips. "After 45 years, I think I've earned the right to see the truth in her eyes." Gerald stood in the foyer of their home, watching through the beveled glass panels he'd installed in their front door decades ago. Thompson's car was parked discreetly down the street. Emily had taken position in the kitchen, legal documents arranged on the dining table Gerald had crafted from oak for their 25th anniversary. The grandfather clock struck 6, its familiar chimes now marking the countdown to confrontation rather than the comforting rhythm of home. When Margaret's sedan pulled into the driveway, Gerald's heart constricted. Despite everything, the sight of her still triggered 45 years of love and memory. She was wearing the blue dress he'd always admired, her silver hair catching the early evening light. For a moment, he almost wavered. Has someone's betrayal left you facing an impossible choice? Share your story, like if you've stood where Gerald stands. Follow to see how he fights for justice. Then he noticed the second car pulling in behind hers, a sleek black BMW. Russell Harmon emerged, straightening his designer suit before moving to open Margaret's door. The tender familiarity of the gesture hardened Gerald's resolve. "They're here," he called softly to Emily. "And she's brought him." Emily appeared at his side, her face pale but determined. "Are you ready for this, Dad?" Gerald nodded, squaring his shoulders. "I've been preparing for this moment since I found that letter." The key turned in the lock, Margaret still using the home key Gerald had given her on their wedding day, now to usher in her betrayal. The door swung open, and Margaret's smile froze when she saw Gerald and Emily standing side by side, faces solemn. "Gerald," she said, recovering quickly. "Emily! I didn't expect you both to be waiting." She stepped inside, Harmon following closely behind. "Russell decided to join us for dinner. I thought it was time you properly met." "We've met before," Gerald said quietly, his eyes locked on Harmon. "At the Children's Hospital fundraiser last year. You were quite interested in our family's charitable trust." Harmon's smile didn't waver, though something flickered in his eyes. "Gerald, good to see you again. Margaret speaks very highly of you." "Does she?" Gerald looked to his wife. "I wonder what else she's been speaking about." Margaret's expression tightened. Gerald, what's going on? Emily, why do you look like that? Perhaps we should all sit down, Gerald suggested, gesturing toward the dining room. We have some matters to discuss. As they moved through the house, Gerald watched Harmon's appraising glance at the custom cabinetry, the hand-carved moldings, the built-in bookshelves, mentally calculating their value, no doubt. The thought made Gerald's stomach turn. When they reached the dining room, Margaret froze at the sight of the documents spread across the table. Her eyes darted to Thompson, who had entered from the kitchen doorway. "Richard," she said faintly, "I don't understand." "I think you do, Margaret," Gerald said, pulling out a chair for her, the chair he'd made with curved arms to accommodate her preference for resting her elbows while they talked after dinner. "Please, sit. You too, Mr. Harmon." Harmon remained standing, his demeanor shifting from charming to cautious. "What exactly is this about?" Gerald lifted the forged letter from the table. "It's about this, for starters, and the falsified bank transfers, the revised will, the second passport, the draining of our grandchildren's education fund." His voice remained steady, though a tear escaped, tracking down his lined cheek. "It's about 45 years of partnership being dismantled in secret." Margaret's face drained of color. "Gerald, I can explain." "I'm sure you can," he interrupted gently. "But first, I'd like Mr. Harmon to explain his previous relationships with Elaine Winters, Patricia Morehouse, and Judith Layton, all wealthy women, all significantly older than him, all left with substantially less after their associations." Harmon's confident facade cracked. "Who've you been talking to?" "The better question," Thompson interjected, "is what judge we'll be talking to tomorrow morning when we file these injunctions freezing all assets pending investigation of fraud." Margaret looked between Harmon and Gerald, confusion and fear warring in her expression. "Russell, what is he talking about?" Gerald felt no satisfaction at the dawning horror on his wife's face, only a profound sadness. "He's talking about the fact that your boyfriend has a pattern, Margaret. You're not his first investment." "That's ridiculous," Harmon snapped, but his eyes darted toward the door. "Is it?" Emily asked, sliding forward the folder containing the investigator's findings. "Because there's a paper trail suggesting otherwise." Margaret's hands trembled as she opened the folder. Gerald watched as 45 years of trust crumbled in real time, her expression shifting from disbelief to devastation. "Margaret," Gerald said softly, "we need to talk." "Alone." Harmon stepped forward, placing a proprietary hand on Margaret's shoulder. "Anything you have to say to Margaret, you can say in front of me." Gerald stood to his full height, the strength of decades of physical labor evident in his still powerful frame. "That wasn't a request, Mr. Harmon. You're standing in my home. A home I built with my own hands for the family you tried to destroy. I'm asking you, just once, to leave." The tension in the room was palpable as Harmon weighed his options. Finally, with a last calculating look at Margaret, he turned toward the door. "Call me when you're done here," he told Margaret. "We'll sort this out." After Harmon left, the silence stretched between the three remaining family members, broken only by the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the hall, a sound that had marked the rhythm of their lives together, now counting down to whatever came next. The community center's meeting room buzzed with subdued conversation. Gerald sat alone at a table near the front, his weathered hands folded atop a leather portfolio, the one Margaret had given him on their 40th anniversary. The irony wasn't lost on him. Around the room, familiar faces from decades of community life stole glances his way, their expressions a mix of curiosity and sympathy. News traveled fast in small towns. Thompson sat to his right, legal documents arranged in meticulous order. Emily occupied the chair to his left, her presence a silent declaration of loyalty. The past 3 weeks had been a blur of legal maneuvers, emergency court hearings, and painful revelations. Today would bring it all to a head. "Are you sure you want to do this publicly?" Thompson asked quietly. We could still arrange a private settlement conference. Gerald shook his head. Some things need to see the light of day. Sunshine's the best disinfectant, my father always said. The door at the back of the room opened. Margaret entered, her usual confident stride diminished to hesitant steps. She'd lost weight, her tailored suit hanging slightly loose on her frame. Behind her came Harmon, flanked by two attorneys with briefcases and hard expressions. Gerald felt a twinge of sadness, seeing his wife of 45 years reduced to this. A woman clinging to a falsehood so desperately she couldn't see the manipulation. All rise, announced the clerk as Judge Henrietta Wilson entered. At 72, Wilson was a local institution, known for her no-nonsense approach and impeccable fairness. Gerald had restored her chamber's bookshelves last year, solid walnut with dovetail joints that would outlast them all. Be seated, Wilson instructed, adjusting her glasses. This is an unusual venue for a court proceeding, but given the community interest and the nature of the allegations, I've allowed it. Her gaze swept the room. I remind everyone this is still a court of law, regardless of location. Decorum will be maintained. Gerald glanced at the back row where his grandchildren sat, adults now with families of their own, their faces solemn. They'd insisted on coming despite his protests. We need to understand what happened to Grandma, his eldest grandson had said. We need to see it for ourselves. Judge Wilson cleared her throat. Mason v. Mason and Harmon, emergency injunction and allegations of fraud. Mr. Thompson, you may begin. Thompson rose, buttoning his jacket. Your Honor, this case represents not merely marital discord, but a calculated scheme to defraud a man of his life's work and his family of their legacy. For the next 30 minutes, Thompson methodically presented their evidence. The forged documents, the hidden accounts, the systematic transfer of assets, and most damning of all, Harmon's history with other wealthy, older women. With each exhibit displayed on the courtroom's projection screen, Margaret seemed to shrink further into herself. Furthermore, Thompson continued, we have documentation that Mr. Harmon has already liquidated portions of the Mason family trust intended for educational expenses of the grandchildren, transferring approximately $300,000 to offshore accounts. A murmur ran through the room. Judge Wilson tapped her gavel once, restoring silence. And finally, Thompson said, we present evidence that Mrs. Mason altered her will without her husband's knowledge, removing provisions for their children and grandchildren in favor of a business partnership with Mr. Harmon, a partnership for which no legitimate business documentation exists. When Harmon's attorney rose for rebuttal, his polished Chicago confidence quickly faltered under Judge Wilson's penetrating questions about the forged documents. Margaret's face had gone ashen as the scope of the deception became clear. Mrs. Mason, Judge Wilson said finally, do you wish to make a statement? Margaret rose unsteadily, looking anywhere but at Gerald. Your Honor, I was assured these arrangements were legitimate, that Gerald would be provided for, that the grandchildren's interests were protected. Her voice quavered. I never intended. Intention is relevant but not determinative, Judge Wilson interrupted. Did you sign these documents knowing they contained false information? Margaret's silence was answer enough. Mr. Harmon, the judge continued, given the evidence presented, I'm referring this matter to the district attorney for potential criminal charges. Mr. Peterson, she addressed Harmon's attorney, I suggest you advise your client of his Fifth Amendment rights. Harmon leaned forward, whispering urgently to his attorney. The lawyer's face hardened as he listened. Your Honor, Harmon's attorney said, my client wishes to propose a settlement. I'll hear it, Judge Wilson replied, though I make no promises regarding the criminal referral. Mr. Harmon will return all funds transferred from the Mason accounts and trusts with interest. He will relinquish any claim to Mason properties or assets. In exchange, Mr. Mason agrees not to pursue criminal charges. Judge Wilson turned to Gerald. Mr. Mason? Gerald rose slowly, his joints stiff from sitting but his back straight. He looked directly at Margaret for the first time since she'd entered. Your Honor, I've spent my life building things meant to last. Furniture that would be passed down through generations. A home that would shelter my family long after I'm gone. A marriage I thought was constructed of the strongest materials: trust, honesty, commitment. His voice caught slightly. I was wrong about that last one. He turned to face the room, taking in the community that had witnessed their life together. I don't want Mr. Harmon's proposal. I want everything returned, yes, but not just the money and property. I want my family's security restored. I want my grandchildren's futures protected. Gerald reached into his portfolio and withdrew a document. This is a revised settlement proposal, Your Honor. It returns all assets to their original state, with one exception. Margaret keeps her personal inheritance from her parents, untouched. The rest, everything we built together, goes into an irrevocable trust for our children and grandchildren, with Margaret and myself as lifetime beneficiaries with equal access. A tear traced down his weathered cheek. I'm not interested in punishment, Your Honor. I'm interested in preservation. What we built deserves better than to be dismantled by deception. Judge Wilson studied the document, then looked at Harmon. Mr. Harmon, this settlement does not address potential criminal charges, which remain at the discretion of the district attorney. But as to the civil matters before me today, I find Mr. Mason's proposal equitable. Mrs. Mason, do you accept these terms? Margaret nodded, tears flowing freely now. Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Harmon? The judge prompted. Harmon's face had lost its smooth confidence, his eyes darting between his attorneys. Yes, I accept. So ordered, Judge Wilson declared, bringing her gavel down with finality. This settlement will be formalized immediately. Mr. Harmon, I suggest you remain available to local authorities. As the room erupted in hushed conversations, Gerald remained standing, watching as Harmon was escorted out by his attorneys. Margaret sat motionless, staring at her hands. Gerald felt Emily's hand on his shoulder. You did it, Dad. No, he corrected gently. We preserved what matters. That's all I ever wanted to do. When Margaret finally looked up, their eyes met across the room, 45 years of shared history suspended between them. In her gaze, Gerald saw something he hadn't expected. Understanding. Not forgiveness, not yet, but recognition of the man she'd almost lost. The man who, even now, had chosen to build rather than destroy. 6 months after the courthouse reckoning, Gerald stood at his workshop bench, the familiar weight of his sanding block comforting in his palm. Golden afternoon light spilled through windows he'd installed himself, illuminating motes of sawdust that danced in the air like memories. The rich scent of cherry wood filled the space, the last boards from a tree he'd harvested decades ago, saved for something special. The cradle was nearly finished. His great-granddaughter would arrive in less than a month, and Gerald worked with the unhurried precision of a man who understood that some things shouldn't be rushed. Each stroke of the sandpaper followed the wood's grain, honoring its natural pattern rather than imposing his will upon it. It's beautiful, came a voice from the doorway. Gerald looked up to see Margaret standing there, a tentative visitor to the space that had once been as much her domain as his. She'd brought coffee in the mug he'd turned for her on their 30th anniversary, a peace offering of sorts. Thank you, he replied, accepting the mug. 6 months of separate bedrooms in the same house, of lawyer-mediated conversations and family dinners where they occupied opposite ends of the table he'd crafted in their first year of marriage. 6 months of rebuilding, one careful piece at a time. Margaret's eyes traced the cradle's curved headboard, where Gerald had inlaid a delicate pattern of leaves and vines. "You've incorporated the family pattern." Gerald nodded. "Emily asked for it specifically. Said she wanted her granddaughter to sleep beneath the same design that watched over her." The pattern had graced every crib, cradle, and bed Gerald had ever built for family, a continuous line connecting generations. Margaret's fingers hovered over the inlay, not quite touching, as if she wasn't sure she had the right. "Harmon was sentenced yesterday," she said quietly. 8 years. The DA found 5 other women. Gerald continued sanding, his rhythm unbroken. "I know," Thompson called. "I've been seeing Dr. Winters twice a week," Margaret offered, referring to the therapist she'd started visiting after the hearing. "She says I was vulnerable to his manipulation because I was afraid of becoming irrelevant, afraid of aging." Gerald set down his sanding block, dusting his hands on his apron. At 68, his fingers were more gnarled than they once were, skin spotted with age and marked by a lifetime of craftsmanship. He felt no need to hide these signs of a life fully lived. "We're all afraid of becoming irrelevant, Margaret. That's why we build things that outlast us." He gestured to the workshop walls, lined with photographs of furniture he'd created over the decades, pieces now gracing their children's and grandchildren's homes. Margaret's eyes welled with tears. "I almost destroyed it all. Everything you built. Everything we built." "Almost," Gerald acknowledged. He ran his palm over the cradle's smooth rail. "But wood is more forgiving than people think. Even when it's damaged, it can be restored if you're willing to put in the work." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of 45 years and 6 months suspended between them. "The trust disbursement came through for the grandchildren's education," Margaret said finally. "Taylor called to thank us. She's been accepted to the architectural program at Cornell." Gerald smiled at the mention of their youngest grandchild, who'd spent countless hours in this very workshop, learning to appreciate the honest work of creation. "She'll make a fine architect. She understands that foundations matter." "Gerald," Margaret began, her voice steadier now, "I know I have no right to ask this, but I'd like to help with the cradle, just the finishing touches. Please." He studied his wife, the woman whose betrayal had nearly cost him everything, whose deception had been laid bare before their entire community. Her hair had more silver now, and new lines etched the corners of her eyes. She looked both older and somehow more authentic than she had in years. "The finish needs to be applied in 3 coats," he said, reaching for a second brush. "Smooth strokes, following the grain. Just like I taught you 43 years ago, when we made our first rocking chair together." The surprise and gratitude in Margaret's eyes spoke volumes as she set her coffee aside and accepted the brush. They worked in companionable silence, the afternoon light shifting as the sun began its descent. Gerald watched Margaret's careful strokes, the concentration in her expression as she honored the wood's natural beauty. Some things couldn't be rushed. Not cradles, not forgiveness, not restoration. As dusk approached, Emily's car pulled into the driveway. Through the workshop window, Gerald could see her heavily pregnant form being helped from the passenger side by her husband. Their son-in-law carried a casserole dish, family dinner night, a tradition Gerald had insisted on maintaining through even the darkest days of the past 6 months. "They're here," Margaret said, setting her brush in the cleaning solution. Gerald nodded, wiping his hands on a cloth. "The first coat needs to dry overnight. We can apply the second tomorrow if you'd like." "I would," Margaret replied softly. "Very much." As they prepared to leave the workshop, Gerald paused at the door, looking back at the cradle. It wasn't perfect. Nothing truly handmade ever is, but its slight imperfections gave it character, told the story of its creation. In the golden last light of day, it seemed to glow from within, promise embodied in wood and craft. "You know," Gerald said, "Taylor asked me something interesting last week. She wanted to know if I thought buildings have memories, if they remember the hands that made them. What did you tell her? Margaret asked. Gerald switched off the workshop light. I told her I don't know if buildings remember, but I know the hands remember every building, every piece, every repair. They walked together toward the house they'd shared for over 4 decades, the home Gerald had expanded and renovated as their family grew, where their children had taken first steps and their grandchildren had played hide and seek during Sunday visits. The porch steps creaked slightly under their weight. Gerald had been meaning to fix that. Inside, the warmth of family awaited. Emily waved from the kitchen where she was arranging flowers in a vase Gerald had turned from maple burl as a housewarming gift when she and Robert bought their first home. Their son Michael had arrived with his wife and teenage sons, setting up the card table for after-dinner games. The grandchildren's laughter echoed from the living room. I was thinking, Margaret said as they paused in the entryway, the cradle will need a matching dresser eventually. Maybe we could design it together. Gerald looked at his wife, seeing beyond the pain of recent months to the foundation that remained, damaged, but not destroyed, weathered, but still standing. I'd like that, he said simply. At the dining table, the one he'd crafted from oak for their 25th anniversary, Gerald took his place at the head. Margaret hesitated only briefly before taking her customary seat at the opposite end. As their family settled around them, filling the spaces between, Gerald caught his wife's eye across the polished expanse. She smiled, tentative, hopeful, real, and Gerald found himself smiling back. Some projects took a lifetime to complete. Some restorations were worth the effort. Pass the bread, please, he said to no one in particular, and many hands reached to help. Folks, when trust splinters like old wood beneath your feet, that first sob comes from somewhere deep, a place you thought was fortified by decades of togetherness. You've been there, haven't you? Sitting at a kitchen table worn smooth by thousands of family meals, staring at evidence of betrayal while the clock ticks away minutes that suddenly feel precious. Like Gerald, you've felt that first tear fall, hot and unexpected, onto hands that have worked and loved and built for a lifetime. The hardest part isn't the shock, it's the memories that follow. Ain't it something how your mind floods with every anniversary dinner, every Christmas morning, every ordinary Tuesday when you pass the coffee without being asked? Those memories don't vanish when trust breaks. They just ache differently, like weather in old joints. The kitchen where you raised your children becomes a museum of what was, the creak of your favorite chair, a reminder of all those evenings spent believing in forever. We spend decades building homes that hold more than furniture. They hold the echoes of birthday candles blown out, of midnight conversations, of grandchildren's laughter bouncing off walls we painted ourselves. When betrayal walks through the door, it doesn't just threaten the present, it tries to rewrite that history, doesn't it? Suddenly you wonder if the floorboards that supported your family's steps were always hiding weaknesses you couldn't see. But here's what I've learned watching Gerald's journey. Wisdom earned through decades doesn't desert you in crisis. It guides you. Those instincts that told you something wasn't right, that carpenter's eye for detail, that nurse's sense for falsehood, that parent's knowledge of when a story doesn't add up. Trust it. Your life experience isn't just history, it's your most valuable tool. When Gerald's trained eye caught that smudged signature, it wasn't luck. It was 6 decades of paying attention. The dignity you reclaim might look different than what you lost. For Gerald, it wasn't about getting even. It was about preserving what mattered most. The legacy built by calloused hands. The future promised to grandchildren. The foundation that remains when decorative elements are stripped away. There's something powerful in standing up not for pride, but for protection. Of family, of truth, of the work of your hands and heart. I've seen folks your age brush aside their own wisdom, thinking younger generations know better about everything from technology to relationships. Don't you do it. The years have taught you to recognize authentic craftsmanship, whether in furniture or friendships. You know the difference between solid oak and veneer, between commitments that weather storms and promises that warp under pressure. That knowledge is hard-earned and worth honoring. Tonight, you might be sitting on a porch swing, listening to cricket song, feeling the weight of betrayal or loss. Your tears are earned, darling. Every one of them. The salt tracks on weathered cheeks map a lifetime of loving deeply enough to be wounded. But remember this, the same hands that tremble with grief today are strong enough to rebuild tomorrow. Not the same structure, perhaps, but something authentic, something that honors the craftsmanship of your life. Maybe, like Gerald with that cradle, you'll find yourself creating something new from old wood, something that carries forward what deserves to endure while leaving behind what was never meant to last. The legacy worth saving isn't in the things that can be taken, but in the values that shaped every choice, every join, every careful measurement of your days. When the stars come out, look up and know you're not alone in this. We're all master builders of one kind or another, restoring what matters one careful piece at a time.